real estate cannot be outright owned, and that could take us into a complicated path explaining that. And a myriad of other assets also cannot be outright owned, but with Bitcoin, we can own it. Can you explain that? Quote, Bitcoin is property rights properly understood.
If you consider all other forms of property, if you own land, you only own the land to the extent that the government gives you jurisdiction of the land. And most families lose their land over 100 years because the property taxes on the land build up to the point where they can't afford to pay the property tax. If I own a company, the government can expropriate it or they can tax it. And the company may be valued based upon the currencies, the cash flows it generates, and the cash flow is in a currency controlled by a politician. So if we consider most forms of property, gold, diamonds, art, land, corporations, bonds, they can either be expropriated or they can be taxed or they can be stolen, they can be regulated. That happens throughout history, right? When, if the regime fails or it flips to being communist, they seize all property. In Venezuela, after the regime changed, they nationalized the oil company. In Argentina, they have waves of nationalizations happen throughout the world. So the question is, what property can you own that cannot be expropriated away, inflated away, taxed away? The only thing, or the best thing we've discovered is digital property in the form of Bitcoin, because the ownership of it consists of having the private keys or the password to the Bitcoin, which you can carry in your head if you need to. The property is in cyberspace. It doesn't have a political nexus. If you own a building in a country, then the mayor, the governor, and the regulators in the nation all have the power to regulate or expropriate or tax away the building. But Bitcoin doesn't have nexus in the real world. It's nexus in cyberspace. It could sit on a satellite. It could sit floating in the middle of the ocean. If you have $1 billion of gold, it would take you 6 months and $5 million to move it, and you would have to get permission of every jurisdiction to move it. If you had $1 billion of Bitcoin, you could move it, in theory, even in a split second, right? Just by transferring the keys. So you could move Bitcoin 1 million times a second for free by transferring the keys. So you have the ability to pick the most favorable jurisdiction. It is the first property in the history of the world that you can take with you to your grave, right? The pharaohs attempted to build pyramids to take with them their gold and their jewels and their boats and whatever, their art. But all those tombs were cracked open and the grave robbers stole it all. And unless you were lucky enough to be buried underneath the sandstorm for 1,000 years, it was all going to be looted and pillaged. And the 1 million Bitcoin are gone. And Satoshi, in essence, took the Bitcoin to the grave or to the ether, wherever Satoshi might be. And if you die in possession of your private keys, the property is gone. In fact, it's better than destroying the property, because if you were to die with your private keys, you've made a pro rata contribution to everybody else on the Bitcoin network to enrich them. So the ultimate charitable contribution to the human race is simply to die with your private keys, because that way everybody else on the network had their purchasing power accreted. That's not something you could do with any other form of property.
No.
Everything else you have to trust with a counterparty. Like gold, you have to store in a bank vault. And the problem is, in nearly every city on Earth over the course of 100 years, the gold is seized. There's only a couple of cities you could have stored gold over the course of the 20th century without having it stolen. And so it's just very problematic. There isn't really any other property I can think of that you can own. And so when I say, Bitcoin is property properly understood, you really do have an unfettered claim to your property rights, and anybody anywhere on earth can have the same strong claim because of the way the network is constructed.